The night was supposed to be quiet, the kind of evening where a man like me, someone who had spent his life in service, training specialized units, breathing in the stench of cordite and sweat from endless hours on the range, could finally sit on his back porch and sip a glass of bourbon while listening to cicadas hum in the distance. But peace has a way of avoiding me, dodging me like an old rival that knows exactly when to strike, and on that particular night, it came in the most ridiculous form imaginable: the Homeowners Association. I had been at war with them for months, though not in the way one might think. It wasn't about the height of my grass or the color of my shutters, though they had tried that angle, writing me up for aesthetic infractions like leaving my trash cans visible for 30 minutes too long, or because my mailbox was half an inch shorter than regulation height, or because I'd installed a flagpole without their permission. The truth was simpler. They hated that they couldn't intimidate me. They had tried, oh yes, with their little letters stuffed in bright, white envelopes like court summonses, each one written with the self-importance of an emperor. But I had faced down cartel enforcers, trained federal operators to clear compounds, and had seen the inside of more black sites than these neighborhood tyrants could dream of in their sterile meetings over coffee and stale donuts. The HOA wanted power, but they didn't understand what real power was, and that ignorance made them dangerous. It all escalated after the incident with my truck, when they told me I wasn't allowed to park my own vehicle in my own driveway because the decal of a falcon holding a rifle, a gift from one of my trainees who'd gone on to make commander, was considered disturbing to the community aesthetic. I laughed at them in the meeting, not because I wanted to, but because the absurdity was too much and nothing humiliates small tyrants more than laughter. From that day on, I knew I'd painted a target on my back. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have possibly foreseen, was just how far they'd go to silence me. It began with the sound of boots on pavement outside my window, the sharp crunch of rubber soles moving in coordinated rhythm for maybe 5 individuals walking like they own the night. I killed the porch light, my instinct snapping awake like a switchblade, and from the shadows, I watched them gather in front of my house. They wore uniforms, at least something that looked like uniforms, dark tactical gear, but too new, too clean, without the subtle wear of real use, no frayed straps, no scuffs on the boots, no patches where patches belonged. Their posture was stiff, rehearsed, the way actors move after studying films, but never living the role. They had badges too shiny clipped to their chests, and the leader, a tall man with a beard that looked like it belonged in a catalog, banged on my door with the side of his fist and announced in a booming voice that they were here on official law enforcement business, that I was under arrest for noncompliance with neighborhood ordinances, a phrase so ridiculous I nearly broke cover by laughing. But I didn't laugh because something about their tone carried intent, false authority laced with menace, like a dog wearing a lion's mane, hoping you wouldn't notice the tail wagging nervously behind it. I didn't answer the door. I wanted to see how far they'd take it. The man knocked again, harder, shouting that they had authorization to detain me, that if I resisted, they'd use force. That's when I realized the HOA had crossed into a new territory. They had hired imposters, men dressed as officers, to intimidate me, maybe even drag me out in handcuffs to humiliate me before the neighborhood. They thought uniforms and fake badges would scare me. They had no idea who I was. I'd trained the real SWAT team of the city, men who could breach a building blindfolded and still clear it without losing a man. I had spent years showing them how to move as one organism, how to think with discipline, how to trust their instincts when bullets split the air. And now, here on my own lawn, a troop of amateurs tried to play cops in front of my house. I crouched low, moving quietly to the side of the window for a better angle. Their equipment was all wrong. One had a belt holster that sagged too low. Another carried a rifle with no magazine inserted, as if he thought the mere silhouette of the weapon was enough to instill fear. But the details they overlooked were glaring to me. No radio chatter, no comms gear in their ears, no subtle movements of men accustomed to danger. These were not operators, they were hired thugs, costumed actors. And yet a dangerous thought crept in: if they were desperate enough to do this, what else might they be desperate enough to attempt? That was when my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize, but the content was chillingly clear. Comply, or next time it won't be pretend. I stared at the screen, feeling a flicker of anger burning under my ribs. They wanted me scared. They wanted me cowed into submission. But fear is a tool I had long ago learned to bend into something sharper, a weapon I could turn against those foolish enough to wield it carelessly. I didn't open the door. Instead, I slipped into the basement where I kept a locked cabinet not filled with weapons, though I had plenty of those, but with memories, binders, and hard drives filled with training manuals, footage, and tactical assessments from my years of instructing. I plugged one in, scrolled through the archives, and smiled when I landed on a particular video of my men, no, not mine anymore, but still my brothers in spirit, running a hostage rescue drill with flawless execution. I remembered each face, each scar, each moment of pride as they surpassed even my expectations. If the HOA thought they could play soldier on my doorstep, I'd remind them what real soldiers looked like. I stayed hidden, listening as the fake officers grew restless outside. One muttered something about this wasn't part of the deal, another hissed for him to shut up. The leader barked for silence, then knocked once more, though his confidence was fading. And in that fading confidence, I saw the first crack in their armor. They would leave soon, but not before I made sure I had enough evidence to bury them. I turned on a hidden camera rig, one I'd installed long ago for reasons just like this, and angled it toward the porch. The footage captured everything: their faces, their sloppy uniforms, their cheap gear. When they finally gave up, marching back to a black van parked down the block, I caught the HOA's emblem, a discreet sticker slapped on the rear bumper, almost mocking me with its brazenness. They thought they had won tonight. They thought they had scared me into silence. But all they had done was declare war, and the difference between them and me was simple: I had been to war before, and I was still here to tell the tale. Morning arrived, but the night's tension didn't fade. It clung to the walls of my house like smoke after a gunfight, seeping into everything, reminding me that the line had been crossed and there was no turning back, no chance of this HOA feud ever resolving with polite letters or neighborly handshakes, because once someone sends imposters in fake uniforms to your door under cover of darkness, you know they've already fantasized about what happens when the bluff doesn't work, and men like that, cowards hiding behind bylaws, are often the most dangerous because they convince themselves that desperation justifies escalation. So, I brewed my coffee black and strong, the way I had learned to drink it in countries where clean water was a luxury, and I sat by the kitchen table staring at the evidence I'd pulled from my hidden cameras, playing the footage back frame by frame, noting details that any investigator would drool over, faces partially concealed but not enough body language of, untrained men pretending to be professionals, a license plate barely visible but catchable with the right enhancement. And as I watched, I weighed my options. I could hand this over to the police, but experience had taught me that bureaucracy loves to drag its feet, and worse, the HOA likely had someone on the inside, maybe a cousin in the department or a friend in the mayor's office, the kind of connections these suburban tyrants brag about at cocktail parties. So, if I went official too, soon I risked giving them time to bury their tracks. No, the first move had to be mine, and it had to remind them, not gently but decisively, that I wasn't some retiree who spent his days pruning hedges. I was the man who had taught the very people they feared how to breach doors, how to neutralize threats, how to control chaos, and if they pushed me into a corner, I'd show them what chaos really looked like. Still, I wasn't reckless. Recklessness is what gets you killed, and I'd buried too many reckless men to make that mistake. So my plan wasn't about charging out guns blazing, it was about intelligence, about leverage, about letting them trap themselves in their own arrogance. I started by canvassing the neighborhood in my own way, not door to door, not like some nosy neighbor with gossip on his tongue, but by observing patterns of cars entering and leaving the cul-de-sac, the timing of trash pickups, the regularity of the HOA president's dog walks. All the little things most people ignore, but a trained eye catalogs automatically. It didn't take long before I noticed a pattern with the black van from last night, reappearing 3 blocks over, parked behind the tennis courts, like it belonged there, though its plates didn't match the state registry when I ran them through one of my old contacts databases, which meant they were burner plates cheap fakes bought online or stolen from some junkyard vehicle, another rookie mistake. I smiled at that. Every slip they made became another nail in their coffin. By noon, I'd already compiled a dossier thicker than the HOA's own ridiculous handbook. Photographs, timestamps, potential identities cross-referenced with the HOA board's membership list, because it didn't take a genius to see that these hired imposters weren't acting alone. They had backing, someone funding them, orchestrating them. And who else but the president himself, a man named Gerald Pierce, a retired accountant with a Napoleon complex who loved nothing more than quoting bylaw. Subsection numbers as if they were scripture. Gerald had once tried to tell me that my front porch flag violated community uniformity standards, and when I told him that flag had flown in combat zones where men had died defending his right to sit comfortably at home balancing spreadsheets, his face turned red and blotchy. And I knew from that day forward he'd make it his mission to break me. Well, missions go both ways. That evening, I received another message, this time slipped under my door in an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, not handwritten, probably to avoid analysis, and it read, "You have 48 hours to remove your non-compliant property structures or face escalation." At the bottom, no signature, just the HOA logo, embossed in red ink like some kind of mafia seal. I laughed, but the humor faded quickly, replaced by a simmering rage, not because they threatened me, but because they threatened poorly with the arrogance of amateurs trying to play wolves in a world that had real predators. I had trained men to respond to threats like this with precision, and now it was my turn to be the operator again. I picked up my secure phone, the one I rarely used, and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered, one I recognized instantly, Captain Ramirez, once my brightest trainee, now leading the SWAT team I had helped shape. "It's been a long time," I said. Silence, then a chuckle. "Damn, I thought you were dead." "Not yet," I replied. "I've got a situation. Not official, not yet, but it's going to get ugly. And it involves people impersonating law enforcement." That last part caught his attention. I could hear the shift in his breathing, the professional tone returning. Impersonation was a big deal, something the real operators took personally. "Where are you?" he asked. I gave him the address, told him not to come with lights and sirens, just eyes and ears. We agreed to meet discreetly. Within the hour, Ramirez arrived in plain clothes, no visible badge, just a man walking up the driveway with the calm confidence of someone who knew he could end a fight with a single motion. We sat in my living room watching the footage together, and I saw his jaw tighten as the fake officers played their charade on screen. "These clowns," he muttered, "they have no idea what they're doing. But this is dangerous. People panic when they see a uniform. They comply." I nodded. That's exactly what they're banking on. But they made a mistake choosing me. He looked at me then, not as a friend, but as a soldier recognizing another soldier ready to step back into the fight. "You want us involved?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. "If we move too early, they'll lawyer up, hide behind technicalities. I want to draw them out, make them overplay their hand. But when the time comes, I need your men ready. I need them to see what real law enforcement looks like." Ramirez grinned, the same grin he had years ago when I pushed him through grueling drills that left lesser men broken. "You got it, old man," he said. After he left, I felt the shift inside me, the transition from homeowner under siege to operator in control. The HOA thought they could intimidate me with fake officers. What they didn't understand was that they had just given me the perfect opportunity to unleash the very force they feared most, the real SWAT team, trained by me, hardened by years of experience, and loyal enough to answer when I called. The next 48 hours would decide everything, and I was ready to show them that suburban tyranny dies quickly when faced with men who've tasted real war. The deadline they gave me came and went like a storm cloud that promises thunder but only delivers silence. And that silence was more unnerving than the threats themselves, because I knew the quiet wasn't peace, it was preparation, the kind of lull I had felt countless times before in hostile territories where enemies waited, breathing just out of sight, gathering their nerve before making a move, And as the hours bled into the second day, I kept my routine, deliberate, methodical mowing my lawn, repairing the fence, even waving at neighbors who pretended not to see me, all the while knowing that eyes were on me, that somewhere behind tinted windows or drawn blinds, the HOA cabal was watching, waiting for the moment to strike. But what they didn't realize was that I was watching them too, every shadow, every car that drove the cul-de-sac twice without stopping, every drone that buzzed overhead pretending to be a hobbyist toy, but flying too steady, too controlled, its lens angled suspiciously toward my property. They were probing, testing, and I let them. Because sometimes you have to let the enemy believe he's winning to make him reckless, and recklessness was the wedge I needed. By dusk, the black van returned. But this time, they didn't park down the block. They rolled right up into my driveway, like they owned it, doors sliding open, 5 men stepping out in the same fake tactical uniforms as before, only now they carried themselves with more aggression, like they'd been coached, as if someone had told them to act tougher to project dominance. But it was still a hollow performance, their steps too heavy, their eyes darting nervously toward each other for confirmation. Real operators don't need that kind of validation. They just move. The leader, Gerald's hired beard, strode to my porch with a folder in his hand, waved it in front of the camera deliberately, and shouted that they now had official documentation authorizing my arrest under civil code violations. Words so absurd, I nearly admired the creativity, except I knew the danger was real, not from the documents, which were worthless, but from the sheer arrogance of men willing to escalate theatrics into physical intimidation. And when intimidation fails, the next step is always violence. I didn't open the door. Instead, I let the cameras record every second, every blustered word, every stage gesture of authority, because evidence was my ammunition now. But I didn't just sit idly. I dialed Ramirez on the secure line and gave him a simple update. They're here again. It's escalating. He didn't ask questions, didn't waste time, just said, "We're already in the area. Keep them there." That was all I needed to hear. My pulse slowed, not sped, as I slipped into the role I had trained so many others to master. Controlled calm under imminent threat. The imposters pounded on the door, shouting louder, one even threatening to break it down if I didn't comply, which almost made me laugh. Any real officer would know forced entry without a warrant is suicide in court, but these weren't officers, and that meant if they broke in, they weren't bound by law, they were bound by desperation, and desperate men make mistakes that get them caught. I moved silently through the house, checking angles, confirming sightlines from my hidden cameras, making sure I had every possible detail covered. Outside, the imposters shifted, their patience thinning, until finally the leader barked an order, and 2 of them stepped off the porch, moving toward the side of the house. That was their mistake, because what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Ramirez and 2 of his men were already shadowing them from the tree line across the street, watching, documenting, ready to intervene the moment the line between impersonation and home invasion was crossed. I didn't see Ramirez, but I knew he was there, the same way you can sense a trained operator even when he blends into the shadows. The imposters reached the side gate, rattled the lock, cursed under their breath when it didn't budge, then moved toward a basement window, trying to pry it open. I let them try. I let the cameras capture every clumsy second of their failed break-in attempt. Then, as the leader's patience finally snapped and he screamed for them to take him out, headlights flooded the street. Not the van's headlights, but 3 unmarked SUVs rolling in fast, stopping hard, doors flung open with precision. And out of them came the men I had trained, the real SWAT team, moving with the kind of fluidity that no actor could imitate, their formation tight, their commands sharp, their presence undeniable. The imposters froze, caught mid-act, their fake authority crumbling under the weight of real power. "Police, drop your weapons." Ramirez's voice cut through the night, like a blade, not a request, but an order forged in steel. The imposters panicked. One dropped his rifle immediately, another tried to bluff, raising his hands, but babbling about jurisdiction. A word he clearly didn't understand, while the leader, foolish and cornered, tried to pull a sidearm from his hip. He didn't even clear the holster before 2 red dots from carbines danced across his chest, freezing him in place. "Don't," Ramirez said coldly, and the man obeyed, his bravado collapsing into fear. Within seconds, they were disarmed, zip-tied, and lined up on the curb like children caught stealing candy, their fake badges and worthless documents scattered on the pavement. I stepped outside then, finally, the porch light snapping on above me, and for the first time, the imposters saw the man they'd been sent a break. I didn't say a word to them. I didn't need to. The look on their faces, the realization that their costumes, their lies, their arrogance had just been shredded by the very men I had molded was enough. Ramirez approached, his expression somewhere between satisfaction and restrained fury. "We've got them," he said, his tone clipped. "But this isn't over. Someone sent them. Someone paid them. And we both know who." My eyes drifted toward the HOA president's house at the end of the street, its windows dark, blinds closed tight, as if pretending ignorance could shield him from the storm he'd summoned. "Gerald," I muttered. Ramirez nodded. "We'll process these clowns, but if you want Pierce, we need proof. Paper trail, payments, something solid. Otherwise, he hides behind lawyers, claims he didn't know." He was right. Taking down the pawns wasn't enough. I needed the king. And that meant baiting Gerald into revealing himself, forcing him to step out of the shadows he loved to operate from. I agreed to let Ramirez's men take the imposters into custody discreetly, no flashing lights, no neighborhood spectacle, because the last thing I wanted was for Gerald to know how close the noose was tightening. As the SUVs pulled away, taking the broken imposters with them, I stood on my porch under the hum of the streetlight, sipping what was left of my bourbon, and I smiled, not because the battle was won, but because the war was finally on the right terms. Gerald Pierce thought he could weaponize fear, but fear is only a weapon in the hands of those who understand it, and I was about to show him that the man he tried to intimidate was the same man who had built the warriors now circling him like wolves. The HOA had declared war. I had just answered. The next 48 hours unfolded like a chess match played in shadows, every move calculated, every piece maneuvered into position, and while the neighborhood pretended to go about its business, mothers jogging with strollers, sprinklers ticking across manicured lawns, the faint smell of charcoal drifting from backyards. I knew the real game was playing out behind closed doors, in whispered phone calls and hidden bank transactions, because Gerald Pierce wasn't the type of man to get his hands dirty. No, he preferred to orchestrate, to sit in his home office, surrounded by plaques from financial institutions and framed photos of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, convincing himself he was a mastermind while pushing others to do his bidding. But what Gerald didn't realize was that the very men he hired had already started talking, and Ramirez made sure every word was recorded, cataloged, and cross-referenced, building a net so tight that not even Gerald's smug grin could slip through. I spent those hours watching, planning, baiting him without his knowledge, filing a deliberately inflammatory appeal against the HOA, written in the kind of language guaranteed to provoke his ego, slipping it into their Dropbox where I knew he'd be the first to read it, mocking his leadership, calling his authority a sham, daring him to respond. Men like Gerald couldn't resist a challenge. They thrived on control, and by sundown the following day, the trap had sprung. It started with an email, poorly encrypted, sent from an address he thought was anonymous, but I had seen enough amateur operational security to recognize his signature style, too many commas, too many capital letters, the same grammatical quirks he used in his endless newsletters, and in that email was everything I needed: explicit instructions to a local security firm, half legitimate at best, authorizing payment for special enforcement action, complete with bank account numbers and dates, a sloppy digital trail that even a rookie investigator could follow. I forwarded it to Ramirez, who nearly laughed when he read it. He hung himself, he said, but I wasn't finished. Paper trails prove intent. But I wanted confession. I wanted Gerald to reveal himself, not just as a petty tyrant, but as the coward who hid behind others' uniforms. So I set the final stage, a recorded meeting, baited by a letter I drafted under the guise of his hired imposters, claiming they hadn't been paid enough, demanding more money to keep quiet. I slipped it under his door in the dead of night, and sure enough, by morning, Gerald was pacing in his driveway, Phone pressed to his ear, his tone sharp, desperate, while his wife pretended to water the flowers as though nothing unusual was happening. The pressure had cracked him, just as I knew it would. By that afternoon, Ramirez and his men were in position, watching from unmarked vehicles while I made my own move, walking straight up to Gerald's front porch, knocking on his door with the calm certainty of a man holding all the cards. He opened it eyes wide, face pale, and for a moment he looked at me the way a man looks at a ghost, as if he'd already rehearsed this encounter in nightmares. "We need to talk," I said, stepping past him before he could object. His house smelled of lemon polish and fear. We sat in his study, where his walls were lined with binders labeled with HOA meeting minutes like they were sacred texts, and I laid the printout of his email on the desk between us. His hands trembled when he saw it. I don't know what this is," he stammered. "Forgery. It has to be." I leaned in, my voice low, steady, the same tone I once used to interrogate cartel lieutenants who thought bravado could shield them. "Gerald, your men already confessed. They told us everything. The payments, the instructions, the promises you made. This paper trail is just the nail in the coffin. You've got one chance to decide how this ends: cooperate or go down hard." His lips quivered, sweat forming at his hairline, and for a moment I thought he'd break completely, but instead he puffed out his chest, tried to summon the old arrogance, muttering about lawyers, about suing for defamation, about how none of this would hold up in court. That's when Ramirez walked in, badge flashing, two SWAT operators flanking him, their presence filling the room like a thunderclap. Gerald's bravado collapsed instantly. He tried to stand to stammer some excuse, but Ramirez cut him off with a single sentence. "Gerald Pierce, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, impersonation of law enforcement, and solicitation of violence." The words hit harder than any fist. His knees buckled, and he sank into the chair, muttering about misunderstandings, about how it was all just to teach me a lesson, as if hiring armed imposters to drag a man out of his house was some neighborhood prank. I watched silently as they cuffed him, reading him his rights, his wife sobbing in the doorway, neighbors gathering outside as the spectacle unfolded. This wasn't just justice, it was exposure, the kind that stripped away the veneer of suburban respectability and revealed the rot beneath. As they led Gerald out, past the same street where he'd once strutted during HOA meetings like a king addressing his subjects, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The war was over. The tyrant had fallen. But victories like this aren't just about the fall, they're about the lesson left behind. In the days that followed, the HOA scrambled to distance itself, board members resigning, meetings canceled indefinitely, bylaws suddenly under review. The neighborhood changed too. People who once avoided me now nodded respectfully, some even stopping to thank me for standing up when no one else dared. I didn't bask in it, didn't gloat. I'd seen too much real conflict to celebrate the downfall of a petty despot. Instead, I returned to my porch, bourbon in hand, cicadas humming, the night finally quiet again. Ramirez stopped by once more, sitting with me under the stars, and he raised his glass with a grin. "You know," he said, "when you trained us, you always said the hardest battles are the ones close to home. Guess you were right." I chuckled, sipping slowly. "Home's worth fighting for," I said, and in that moment, I knew that whatever battles lay ahead, whether in distant lands or right here in the manicured streets of suburbia, I'd face them the same way I always had: calm, prepared, and utterly unafraid. Because the HOA had tried to weaponize fear against me, but fear only controls the untrained. And I had trained the best,